Hello, it's your friendly online adjunct professor here, Professor Olivetti, and today we're going to look at the Passion narrative in the Gospel according to Luke. Now, before we get there, the Passion narrative, we have to look at the whole structure. All right, Luke has really been building up to this event. Right, this is all going to happen in Jerusalem. As you can see, we have 2 chapters here of ministry in Jerusalem before the Passion, as we call it, gets started. But for most of the gospel, you had some introductory material here and some material where Jesus is preaching to his own people, the people of Galilee, right? Kind of the rural area. But then he leaves there after beginning his ministry, showing a seed of his ministry, and starts making his way to Jerusalem. And the bulk of the gospel is spent in this journey. Well, guess what? We're finally there. So as we see there in chapter 19, he's proceeded on his journey up to Jerusalem. It's the narrative climax, right? So it's interesting, this up to Jerusalem. It's like the action is building up, right? And he enters on a colt or a baby horse. Now, this is interesting and unexpected, right? Because the people, you'll see, receive him as the Messiah. So he looks to them like he is going to be the fulfillment of their desires, right? Of their expected desires of Messiah. They think, it seems, that he's going to be the one who delivers them from Roman oppression, reunites the 12 tribes of Israel, gives Israel political independence, and makes it a light for all the nations of the earth. In other words, they are looking for a kind of military king who's going to give them political independence, right? Make them a free country again. A king like that would ride a war horse, right? So again, Jesus seems to be letting them know here, not the kind of Messiah you expected. So they see the messianic promises being revealed, but in an unexpected way when he rides in on a baby horse, right? This is not a military Messiah. But the people do recognize him as the Messiah. And they cry out, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest," right? The religious leaders, though, they do not see it. And they tell the people in the crowd, they tell him to tell the people in the crowd to stop yelling at him, to stop acknowledging him as the Messiah. And he says, you can't stop it, right? If they were silent, the stones would cry out. So right away, we see as soon as he's getting to Jerusalem, we see this strong juxtaposition of, we're going to see people, we just call them the people, right, who seem to see in some way that he is the Messiah, right? Now, again, maybe they don't have a full understanding. It seems like no one really understands how that's going to work right now, but they are acknowledging, they are having a positive acknowledgement. They are seeing something special is going on here in the one who is sent from God, Jesus, right? The religious leaders and political leaders of the Jewish people, they are just as much not seeing it and denying it and even standing against it. And they will try to eliminate Jesus when he gets to Jerusalem. Jesus, like maybe some others, can see this coming. You see here, again, another unexpected thing. They would think that the king would come, the Messiah would come and be triumphant and joyful into Jerusalem. But what happens? As he drew near, he saw the city and he wept over it. If this day you only knew what makes for peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. For the days are coming when your enemies will raise a palisade against you, and they will encircle you and hem you in on all sides. They will smash you to the ground, right? They will not leave one stone unturned. And this is because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Now, this is something that is reflects a fuller understanding, in this case, a fuller understanding of history. During the time of Jesus, Luke and other Jews and God-fearers amongst the Greeks, they did not know in about 33 AD or 33 CE, depending on which system you want to use, they did not know that the temple was going to be destroyed. But when Luke was writing, it was after 70 AD, right, which is the same as 70 CE. And he writes this into the narrative, right? Now, this is an interesting phrase here. It seems that in some ways Jesus is blaming the destruction of Jerusalem on the way that the city does not recognize, right, the time of visitation, the time when the Messiah, the one sent from God, has come to them, right? Now, you could interpret that in a vindictive sense, but that doesn't really fit with Luke at all. If you look at the history, you'll see what happens is that around in 70 AD, right, this would be about 40 years after the Jews in the mainline Jews, or the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem, rejected Jesus, the peaceful Messiah, right? They rejected the suffering servant. They rejected the Son of Man, right? They said, nope, we don't want to do it God's way. And they kept looking for this military Messiah. And guess what? In 70 AD, there was revolt amongst the Jews, and they tried to get rid of the Romans through violence and force. There was a military rebellion, and guess what happened? The Romans destroyed Jerusalem. They sacked the place. So when Jesus says here, you didn't recognize the time of visitation, right? The author writing later knows that the temple and Jerusalem do get destroyed because because some of the Jews, what we would call the mainline Jews at that point, the Jews who didn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah, they continue to look for this military solution. They continue to look for this violence, right, to overthrow the Roman oppressors. So in a way, Jesus and Luke is saying, man, if they just would have understood how Jesus was the Messiah, how he was changing the world and would have freed Jerusalem and everyone, just like he freed the early Jerusalem church from Roman oppression, not through violence, but through compassionate sharing with each other. We'll get to that later in the course. So in short, you can see the author knew that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed because they were writing after 70 AD about events here that were going on around 33 AD. Make sense? It's what we can call remembering with fuller understanding. So when Jesus goes in, it kind of seems shocking that he might go in and flip and drive out the people who are selling things in the temple. You might say, oh, you wouldn't expect Messiah to go against the temple. But this was something that the Jewish prophets of old had done. And so when he's doing this, he really is just fulfilling his role and living out his role as the fulfillment of the prophets, right? So it's actually quite messianic, and in some ways would have been expected. Now, some people don't like it, like the people who are benefiting from the temple, the Jewish religious authorities, the chief priests, the scribes, right? And the leaders of the people, the Sanhedrin. They're going to try to kill him, right? But guess who does respond? The people, right? And we're told here, all the people. So Jesus gets a very good reception here from the Jews we're told in general, right? All the people when he first comes to Jerusalem. We're going to see that change. And again, we'll take a look why. But really, Luke sets up here this juxtaposition. We're going to see it throughout the gospel, throughout the rest of the gospel here. The Jewish religious and political authorities, they are antagonistic to Jesus. They want him dead, right? The people in Jerusalem, they like him, right? They're hanging on his every word. And here's one of those Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah, right? He'll come suddenly into his temple, and he will refine and purify silver, right? Purify the Levites, right? Straighten them out in there. Okay, so let's look at a little introduction from Byrne to the Passion narrative itself. And this is the part of the gospel that explains Jesus's suffering and death. So the first thing he makes a point of here on page 183 is that this gospel, just like the other gospels, is not a historical biography of Jesus. They're not trying to tell the historical facts in the contemporary way that someone would try to write a biography. What they're trying to do is share the faith. And so a big part of that is explaining, right, how God's chosen Messiah could be tortured to death and executed. Right? He was supposed to be God's king that would bring peace to the world. This is not what people expected at all. So what Luke does, which is the same thing which reflects what the early church did, is that they find the answer in the Old Testament scriptures. They find the answers in the same prophets, in the same tradition that let them know the Messiah was coming. So they're kind of doing a reading of the scriptures again. They're kind of going through all those prophecies about the Messiah, and also the characters that are connected with the Messiah and messianic in their own way. The Son of Man, for example, the suffering servant, right? And they're saying, oh, okay, now we understand how there could be a Messiah who doesn't kill the Romans, but instead gets killed by the Romans, right? Now, don't forget, and then is risen from the dead. It's an important part of the story, right? But we see first this movement back to the Old Testament, which is really a strong part of the Jewish tradition. You know, Lofink in his book, Does God Need the Church? He talks about the way that the Jewish tradition looks backwards to understand the future. Right? He says like someone rowing a boat in Crew or something, right? Where you're looking backwards and you're watching what happened. You're watching the way that the wake caused from the boat is moving. And if it's straight, you know you're going straight, right? So they look back and they say, well, what did the prophet say? What happened in the past? And he points out that it's understood by the early church We can see it here clearly in Luke that this execution of Jesus was part of the redemption or the freeing of people from slavery. It was part of the salvific act or the saving of people, right? Not from, well, yes, from Roman political oppression. We'll see how that works. But that all of this is according to the Old Testament scriptures. So we see St. Paul saying in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, right? This is all in there. They can find it all in the Old Testament, all in their own tradition. And he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, right? So they find the explanation. They can understand it better now. Again, people were confused at the actual time, and that's in the gospel according to Luke too. People didn't get it. But once they said, "What? How could this happen?" They look back in Scripture, and in Luke's gospel, it's actually the risen Christ that explains it to them, that shows them, "Hey, look, this all happened in Scripture." The disciples come to full faith when, beyond simply recognizing him as the risen Lord, they understood from his instruction that the suffering and the death of the Messiah was something that had to happen according to the plan God announced in the Scriptures. So they could see it. It was right there. The prophet said it was going to happen this way, even though we didn't get it at first. Okay. So again, there's kind of an interesting dynamic set up here, where the antagonists are the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, right? And they all have a vision of the Messiah, who's basically going to validate their own agenda, that they, as the leaders of the Jewish people, be the leaders of a free and more powerful Jewish people, right? They have their own desires, which are blinding them from seeing the actual Messiah that Jesus is, the kind of Son of Man Messiah, right? The Messiah who will suffer for the sake of his people and die to free them from the oppressive forces of sin. And not just Roman oppression, but all forms of oppression. So there's kind of a deeper messianic understanding here, The chief priests, the scribes, the Jewish religious authorities, they don't see it. They're looking for their expected kind of Messiah. And when Jesus comes as a more profound and effective kind of Messiah, right? One who brings peace to Jerusalem and the whole world, not strife and rebellion against Rome. He's not against Rome. And that's what's really interesting. They can't understand, right? And it's not the first time we've seen this dilemma in the Old Testament. The whole book of Jonah, for example, points out this tendency in the Jewish tradition to think if God is for us, then he's against the other people, right? If he loves us, then he must hate our enemies. Well, this isn't the first time this has been challenged, right? This isn't the first time that the Jewish tradition, the Israelite tradition has said, well, wait a minute. We're making this assumption, but that doesn't quite seem to fit with what's been revealed to us about God. He's the God of all, right? So you end up having this dramatic power struggle, as Byrne calls it, between the visitor from God, right? Jesus, the one who is here and allowing us to, the one who's revealing the hospitality of God to us, but also allowing us to participate in it. Which, remember, that is the kingdom of heaven. That is the true freedom, right? So there's a struggle between the one from God, Jesus the Messiah, and the Jewish and religious political authorities of the time. And that's the real crux. Rome, the people who actually tortured and executed Jesus to death, the Roman government, they are out of the picture. Luke is like removing them. They're saying, no, this has nothing to do with Rome, right? This is all about the corrupt Jewish leaders not being able to see the true Messiah because they blinded themselves by their own desires, right? Matter of fact, in Luke, the Romans, in the form of Pontius Pilate, continually proclaims Jesus' innocence. Just keeps trying to say, no, he didn't do anything wrong. Stop it. Stop trying to kill this guy. And only carries out the execution because they're backed into a corner. Right? So what Burns sees here is that Luke is trying to tell the Christians of his time, don't blame the Romans. We can live in the Roman Empire. We do not have to rebel against them. So the blame goes on the corrupt Jewish religious authorities who weren't really living out who they were supposed to be. They weren't really following the prophets. They weren't really following God. Jesus, the Messiah, is really following God. And that's why he's clashing with them. Rome, that's just the tool. It's not their fault that they killed Jesus. They were just kind of like a tool in the hands of the Jewish religious authorities. Makes sense, right? When Luke is writing for Gentiles living in the Roman Empire. And he wants to let them know we can live here. We don't have to blame these people. Now, it also makes sense if you realize at this time that these both Jewish and Gentile believers were being kicked out of the Jewish synagogues during the time Luke was writing. And the rabbis in the Jewish world, they said at some point, no, Jesus is not the Messiah. Anybody who says that should be kicked out of the synagogues. And there were people like St. Paul, he was called Saul at that time, that would actually go around and bring Jews who said Jesus was Messiah back to Jerusalem in chains so they could be whipped and chastised. So not only was their motivation to have peace with Rome, for Christians to make peace with Rome during the time that Luke was writing, but there was also a strong antagonism between the Jewish religious authorities and those Jews who believed Jesus was the Messiah. And they said, you can't believe Jesus is the Messiah, and they kicked them out of the synagogues. So Byrne continues here. It's really the most profound contest. It's the spiritual forces of good versus evil that are really being played out. Right? The Jewish religious authorities are evil. They're representing Satan, right? They're following evil. And we're even told when Judas decides to betray Jesus and turns him in to the Roman authorities to be tortured and killed, Luke explained it's because Satan has entered into him. He was following the devil, evil. It's very black and white, and it's presented in the most fundamental sense. Now, the Gospel according to Luke can be contrasted to, especially the Gospel according to Mark, because Jesus is very cool and under control. Now, he suffers. He does go through anguish, emotional anguish, trying to decide to when he faces the temptation. of should he go through with his mission when it includes him being tortured to death. It's not like he doesn't care, or he doesn't have an emotional reaction, or he doesn't experience anxiety and pain. But it's not like in the Gospel according to Mark, where he really is, his humanity is really stressed, where he really feels like very similar to the way anybody else would feel in that situation. So as Byrne puts it, what Luke brings out are certain aspects of the meaning of Jesus' death, that he died in the freedom of love, a human love enacting the divine love that drove his entire mission, that his death brought about forgiveness, that attending to it were all the qualities, healing, assurance, peace, that have been features of his ministry as a whole. So Luke explains the whole passion narrative, the whole suffering and death of Jesus, in a way that really brings to light what Jesus' mission was all about. And just the way he healed people out of compassion, right? Included people out of compassion. During his death, he is not going to lose sight of that, right? And we'll see him love till the end. And in the midst of his suffering, he always remains free to love others. He's always, in that way, in control. That no matter what you do to him, right, he can love you. And this is very important theologically in Luke and for the whole Christian tradition. It's very important, you see, in our very understanding of what the essence of God is. We'll see later writers like St. John the Evangelist, right, writing, God is love. And you can see that in Luke, right? Jesus as the incarnation of God, as the presence of God on earth, he just loves no matter what. Even the people who are torturing him to death, he loves them.